purpose of Freethought Forum is to be vigilant to the encroachment of religion into government and to educate the general public as to what a freethinker is.
My thoughts give me power.
No scholar can map them.
No hunter can trap them. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei. No person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei.
I think as I please, and this gives
Hello,
me
my name is
pleasure.
Janie Hegarty, and this is Freethought Forum. This summer is the anniversary of the famed Scopes trial, and it only seems appropriate that I spend a half an hour reviewing that day in July, what led up to it, and what evolved from it to the present day, a review of the Scopes trial, then and now. I had my first taste of the Scopes trial in the 9th grade, around 1970, when my progressive Northeast High School presented the film Inherit the Wind to the entire freshman class. I later found out that movie was a mere Hollywood concoction of what really happened. That fateful hot summer day in 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee, and I'll discuss more about that later in this talk. The trial of the century, or the monkey trial as it has often been referred to, began that day with a statement from the prosecution. The courtroom was stifling hot and packed with spectators from the local community, the media, and the participants of the trial. One of the prosecutors appeared on the verge of collapse from the heat, rescued by the defense with a fan. The chief prosecutor, Tom Stewart, began his statement after preliminary rounds that John Scopes violated the anti-evolution Tennessee statute by teaching that mankind is descended from a lower order of animals, and therefore he has taught a theory which denies the story of divine creation of man as taught in the Bible. The statute in question was spawned by the Tennessee legislature earlier that year and became the major impetus behind the trial of the century. The then governor of Tennessee, Austin P.A., in the end made the decision of signing the bill into law. He hailed the final passage of the bill as a distinct protest against an irreligious tendency to exalt so-called science and deny the Bible in some schools and quarters, a tendency fundamentally wrong and fatally mischievous in its effects on our children, our institutions, and our country. He at the same time assured opponents that the statute will not put our teachers in any jeopardy, but if he had even taken a perusal of Tennessee high school biology textbooks, he would have thought otherwise. Following up the bill was Governor P.A.'s attempts to reform his state's public school system. P.A., despite his progressive attitudes of modern education, saw a conflict between fundamentalism and modern education. He essentially was trapped between the two, and majoritarianism ruled, one of the reasons for his signing of the bill. Fundamentalism was in its heyday in 1925, and one of the premier rejoicers of the new Tennessee law was William Jennings Bryan, a staunch fundamentalist in the early part of the century, whose 35-year-long career in politics and public speaking were dominated by his fundamentalist crusades, extolling the virtues of Christianity and vehemently declaring the evils of evolution. His vocation turned to speaking and writing and continually traveled the world, and the country and the world, giving an average of 200 speeches a year. He was a man on a mission, speaking primarily on political and religious issues. In his final years of his life, his two platforms for challenge were conservative publican administrations in Washington and teaching evolution in public schools. The progressive Bryan's stand on anti-evolutionism was compatible with his progressive politics as they went hand in hand with support of reform and majoritarianism. It emanated as well with support of reform and majoritarianism. It emanated as well from his personal Christian doctrine and beliefs. He objected to the naturalistic explanation of Darwinian theory and described it as dangerous, and this can be explained in his quote, "Because I fear we shall lose the consciousness of God's presence in our daily life if we must accept the theory that through all the ages no spiritual force has touched our life of man and shaped the destiny of nations. He also saw evolution as the merciless law by which the strong crowd out and kill off the weak. In other words, that a law of hate has evolved us into the human perfection we are today. His own unique, misguided interpretation of Darwinian natural selection theory. He denounced the same survival of the fittest doctrine by applying it to the brutalities of World War I, where supposedly Christian nations engaged in combat where natural selection based on violent and fatal competitive struggle is the gospel of the German intellectuals. This was one reason why Bryan saw Darwin as dangerous and fought most of his adult life to suppress the teaching of evolution. Bryan also felt that there was a movement away from Christianity, as this was about the time when an extensive survey emerged indicating that the proportion of disbelievers in immortality rose considerably from the freshman to the senior year in college. Disbelief, as you can logically imagine, was higher among scientists, especially biologists. Be it to say that Bryan placed the blame on the teaching of evolution as the cause of the increase in disbelievers. He began receiving letters from parents and students who saw the teaching of evolution in public schools as a way to undermine Christian faith and values. But hail the university professor who actually viewed their teaching for this reason, by way of teaching critical thought and scientific inquiry. David Starr Jordan, a well-known evolutionary biologist at Stanford University, quoted it best when he described Protestant revivalism as simply a form of drunkenness no worthy of respect than the drunkenness that lies in the gutter. Bryan fervently continued his crusades, lashing out against the teaching of evolution. His power of influential oration tactics rallied the population. He was entertaining and won over audiences with his dramatics and exaggerated accounts of far-fetched evolutionary explanations for human origins. One he used was to distort the creation of the eye and how it began as a light-sensitive freckle. He turned his misuse of Darwinian theory into a joke, and the audiences couldn't get enough. His winning over an audience was his main objective because they hopped on the Christian bandwagon right along with him. Is it not easier to believe in a God who can make an eye? He suggested, the quick fix for an audience of gullible, God-fearing Christians whose knowledge of science or its inquiry was minimal at best. Bryan had a rare talent of finding the weaknesses in his opponent's arguments, but this was not always the case. However, in 1921, he challenged the University of Wisconsin President Edward Burge in its alleged anti-religious teaching. The issue of academic freedom for university students and professors was the highlight, and Burge emerged the winner. Later that same year, Bryan had gotten wind of a resolution in Kentucky whereby the state's Baptist State Board of Missions sought to enact a law against the teaching of evolution. Bryan was soon in Kentucky to support the measure, and despite his influence, the bill had lost one vote by one vote in the State House of Representatives. But legislative reform nonetheless spread quickly, only bringing to fruition Bryan's zealous remark, "The movement will sweep the country, and we will drive Darwinism from our schools." Florida followed suit shortly thereafter. They declared that it is improper and subversive to the best interest of the people for public school teachers to teach as true Darwinism or any other hypothesis that links man in blood relationship to any form of lower life. Bryan himself reflected his view when he primarily objected that the teaching of evolution should not be taught based on fact, but on hypothesis. He attempted to coerce the Florida legislature to adopt a resolution similar to the bill in Kentucky, but in order to avoid any possible lawsuit action, it instead passed an advisory resolution rather than law. They didn't view the teaching of evolution as a criminal act, but rather an impropriety, and felt a penalty was unnecessary. Anti-evolutionists soon made Tennessee a target, especially after the defeat of anti-evolution bills in neighboring states. You could say that it was ripe for picking. Most of Tennessee's population was Protestant and boasted about 1 million church members, almost half of them Baptists. It also had a sufficiently diverse population to foment tensions over recent developments in religion. Racial tensions existed as well and were hot issues within Tennessee culture and society, exploding into racial riots and Klan violence. Anti-evolutionism was deemed as a way to shroud the ills of the state. And where were the defenders of evolutionary thought? They were in the background, and it's important to remember that they were not the majority of the country and included both non-believers and Christians. Even one of Nashville's newspapers denounced the anti-evolutionism movement, as well as Bryan himself. The issue of anti-evolution in Tennessee was on a roll, and there was no turning back, and a legislative challenge by fundamentalists was inevitable. And so it was. A bill was offered to the Tennessee legislature, making the teaching of evolution in the schools a misdemeanor, punishable by a fine of up to $500. It passed 71-5. Thus, the law teaching any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man had descended from a lower order of animal, was now a bill in the House of Representatives. Opponents of the bill soon began to work on the Senate, beginning with the question posed in the Nashville Banner. Is it the intention of all those who advocate free expression to let this pass unprotested? Opponents wrote letters expressing their shame and outrage over the bill, with one writer pleading, "Let us not blow out the light as long as the student desires to learn." Another wrote, "According to the greatest scientific authorities on earth, evolution is no longer regarded as a theory, but an established fact." An editorial from another Nashville paper responded with, "There is no reason why the discoveries of geology and astronomy should be challenges to the Christian faith." Opposition to the bill came from modernist clerics, scientists, and non-believers. Even the clergy supported the view that science must be taught in colleges and taught by scientists, as one cleric exclaimed, "Neither priest nor prophet nor apostle nor God ever made the slightest contribution to our knowledge of natural science." They disagreed with the law emanating, and from the words of another cleric, from a false conception that our Christian faith needs to be sheltered behind bars. From the opposition, 3 key points emerged, which eventually became important in the Scope's defense. 1, the defense of individual freedom. 2, an appeal to scientific authority. And 3, a mocking ridicule of fundamentalists and biblical literalism. Both bill supporters and opponents continued their influence on the Tennessee legislature, and majority supporters pushing to pass the bill and the minority opponents appeal to veto it. The arguments between the two sides flared. Opposition had hoped to appeal to Governor P.A.'s progressive platform, his support of public education, school reform, and a longer school year. But he, as we know, in the end sided with the majority, the safe route to keep the fundamentalist masses, no pun intended, in check. The seed was planted. Governor P.A.'s quote, "I will remind you of, as it serves an omen, that it will not put our teachers in any jeopardy." The plant was ripe for the taking. The new Tennessee legislative law wasn't dismissed by interested parties, namely the American Civil Liberties Union. The ACLU didn't view the enactment of the law as an insignificant act, nor did they view the anti-evolution crusade in isolation. The advancement of Protestant culture was in full swing through legislative resolutions and bills, and the ACLU took notice, not of the advancement of fundamentalism in and of itself, but of its threat to freedom and individual liberty. With this particular bill, they were concerned with the threat to academic freedom. The ACLU, in its history, were not too concerned about issues involving governmental efforts to protect or promote religious beliefs. But the passage of the Tennessee law to outlaw the teaching of evolution sparked their desire to enter the game. The ACLU began as the National Civil Liberties Bureau in 1917, primarily to defend conscientious objectors and anti-war protesters during World War I, after it split from the American Union against militarism. Their tenet at its inception, led by Roger Baldwin, a social worker educated at Harvard, was the interest in preserving civil liberties in America because the rights of both individuals and minorities are being grossly violated throughout the country. Baldwin, prior to the war, campaigned for many majoritarian reforms, but he shifted his interests to the defense of individual rights under majority rule. At that time, the threat of communism due to the Russian Revolution emerged, and most states outlawed possession of or display of the red flag of communism. Any violent or disruptive activities against the government were met with newly enforced laws enacted to keep crime at bay, especially from the revolutionary radical element. The Justice Department so much as deported alleged communists to Russia. The government viewed this as a threat to the structure of American society, and the soon-to-be ACLU viewed this as a threat to civil liberties. With the new ACLU, there was a reorganization and focus. Its focus now primarily in labor issues, including public school teachers. Only three attorneys were part of the organization at its inception. One of the most influential lawyers of the group was Arthur Garfield Hayes, who reiterated, "We should bear in mind the fact that there may be no greater oppression than by rule of majority." The ACLU's tie to labor kept them in contact with one of labor's most prolific legal defender, Clarence Darrow. He was perhaps the most famous trial lawyer in America, and after a run for Congress in the late 1890s, he became involved in labor matters. He, after some time, turned to criminal law. One of his most well-known criminal cases, generating much publicity, culminated in the verdict of non-guilty for the murder of a student by two classmates. The defense was based on free will, not individual responsibility, and this outraged many Americans. Clarence Darrow called himself an agnostic, though technically he was an atheist. He referred to the concept of original sin and salvation through divine grace as a very, very dangerous doctrine. He viewed Christianity as a slave religion and spent much of his life ridiculing traditional Christian beliefs through public debates and writings. His intentions to ridicule were to debunk Christianity. He, contrary to Christian thinking, viewed the theory of evolution as providing a better basis for morality, in that no one can feel this universal relationship without being gentler, kindlier, and more humane towards all the infinite forms of beings that live with us and must die with us. He delighted in challenging traditional concepts of morality and religion. And when the Scopes trial came into being 2 years later, Clarence Darrow volunteered his services as the defense at no charge for this very reason, to debunk Christianity. He was to focus the attention of the country on the program of Mr. Bryan and other fundamentalists in America. Thus, in 1924, the ACLU launched its entry into the issue, leading to the Scopes trial by issuing its first public statement to defend the right of public school teachers to free speech both inside and outside the classroom. They added to the statement to include anti-evolution laws as one of its concerns. As soon as the Tennessee bill was enacted, the ACLU took the bait. They responded by writing an offer in the Chattanooga Times, a newspaper who opposed the statute, to challenge the new law. The release stated, "We are looking for a Tennessee teacher who is willing to accept our services in testing this law in the courts." A small town between Chattanooga and Knoxville, the struggling community of Dayton, became the trial place through city leaders who wanted to put the town on the map. But at that time, they had no idea just how much. Dayton would cease to be the town that it once was. Unlike the Hollywood of John Scopes' classroom arrest, while teaching evolution in the classroom, he was literally plucked from the roll list of teachers in Dayton in a strange set of circumstances. Two city attorneys, brothers in fact, in Dayton agreed to prosecute the case if a local teacher had taught evolution after the enactment of the law until the end of the school year, even though ironically they doubted the constitutionality of the statute. Another attorney, a former Vanderbilt football player, volunteered to assist the two brothers. They turned down the ACLU's offer to pay for their expenses for their work. Humorously, the town's drugstore had a role to play in all this, as it was the local meeting place over an ice cream soda for the town's businessmen during this time of prohibition. One bevy of drugstore men included the town's school superintendent, who sided with the anti-evolution statute and envisioned future publicity coming to his town. Another member, a former New Yorker, now mine owner, added his 2 cents and boasted having ACLU connections in New York and embraced the staging of a test case in his adopted town. The drugstore gang began priming one particular young science instructor and part-time football coach named John Scopes, even so much as offering him the bribe of a soda fountain drink. A 24-year-old chain smoker, Scopes opened his civic biology textbook after replying to their questions about his teaching that nobody could teach biology without teaching evolution. Ironically, John Scopes wasn't even the regular biology teacher. He was filling in for the ill principal who was the regular biology teacher. He clarified that yes, he had used a section of discussion of evolution for review purposes for the class. It appeared that John Scopes was the ideal test case for the ACLU challenge of the statute. Unlike the regular teacher, Scopes was single, no family, laid back, wasn't intending on staying in Dayton. He appeared to be the quintessential young science teacher, and being boyish looking and wearing horn-rimmed glasses gave him an air of appearing academic. His shy and likable nature was not a threat to parents and taxpayers alike. ACLU counsel Arthur Garfield Hayes later confided that we sought to find a defendant to present the issue. We could not have improved on the individual. Scopes appeared to be the right defendant and would undoubtedly cause no trouble. The drugstore gang pressed Scopes to accept the ACLU challenge. He said he'd be glad to do it. Amusingly, for the sake of legality, Scopes was served a warrant for his arrest. The beginnings of the Scopes trial were in place, all but the legal prosecution and defense. The headlines spread throughout the country. Tennessee newspapers criticized Dayton for staging such an outlandish trial. The Chattanooga Times viewed the trial as a humiliating proceeding and claimed that every lawyer in the state is holding his head in shame, and referred to it as the Dayton serio comedy. The Nashville Tennessean questioned the wisdom of Dayton in its methodology of choosing the avenue of the Scopes trial as a way to bring publicity to the town. Southerners were conscious of their national image and took exception to some of their remarks, one of which from the Herald Tribune that while the South has advanced industrially, it has not recovered intellectually, and saw the Scopes events as reaffirming stereotypes about the South. Because of the media publicity and the knowledge of Scopes' lack of defense at this point in time, the law professor John Neal from Knoxville approached Scopes regarding counsel, as the ACLU had not yet made arrangements. Neal accepted that Scopes taught about human evolution, but denied that it conflicted with the biblical account. Legislative enactment cannot make it so, he added. He further explained, we regard it as equally un-American and therefore unconstitutional, whether it is kingly or ecclesiastical authority or legislative power that would attempt to limit human mind in its inquiry after truth. His counsel, however, would be under the condition that it take place in either Knoxville or Chattanooga, and this prompted further debate about the trial's venue. and it was eventually decided to take place in Dayton. As I prescribed him previously, William Jennings Bryan joined the fray and continued his services for the prosecution. Although he hadn't practiced law in 30 years, he sensed this as a prime opportunity for gaining popularity for his fundamentalist cause. The World's Christian Fundamentals Association were coincidentally meeting in Tennessee at the time of Scope's arrest, and Bryan was its main speaker. Although this meeting was not held as a response to the statute, it didn't waste time in siding with the statute, and this helped to attract Bryan at this Baptist-dominated event. Bryan was ultimately accepted on the team of prosecutors against John Scopes with a note of appreciation for the invitation, and he added, "I shall of course serve without compensation." The ACLU flinched as this test case was now turning into a trial on evolution, a majority rule rather than statute, and take away from the issue at stake, that of individual liberty. If this weren't bad enough, the second threat to their initial intention was the entrance of Clarence Darrow into the legal arena, as now there was Bryan against Darrow, and the trial would no doubt lead to a battle over religion. Once Darrow got wind of Bryan's involvement in the trial, Darrow was hooked. "At once I wanted to go," he announced. Darrow offered co-defense to a Dudley Field Malone, a lawyer with a zeal for radical causes, and with whom Darrow was in counsel on another case. After Darrow's and Malone's agreement for the defense, the ACLU was no longer in control and never regained it. Darrow set the tone of the case almost immediately. Had Mr. Bryan's idea of what a man may do towards free thinking existed throughout history, we would be hanging and burning witches and punishing persons who thought the earth was round. The townspeople embraced the would-be circus. It was estimated that 30,000 people would descend on Dayton for the Bryan-Darrow battle. The business aspect of the entire affair became popular and lucrative. The word monkey contributed to the circus-like atmosphere. Shops on Main Street were newly decorated with pictures of monkeys and apes. One sign featured a long-tailed primate holding a bottle of patent medicine. Another a chimpanzee drinking soda. The same drugstore where Scopes was wined and dined offered Simeon sodas. The constable's motorcycle carried a sign reading Monkeyville Police, and a local delivery truck had Monkeyville Express emblazoned on its side. The business group, the Progressive Dayton Club, voted to raise a $5,000 advertising fund to promote business development during the trial. On May 25, 1925, the case went before the grand jury who heard the prosecution, which was then followed by the presentation from the judge in the case, John T. Ralston, who urged that John Scopes be indicted for the violation of the statute against the teaching of evolution, but at no more than a high misdemeanor, as instructed to the jury. He added that the case should not make reference to the constitutionality of the statute, nor to the wisdom of it, but only to the issue of it being the evil example of the teacher disregarding constituted authority in the presence of those whose thought and morals he is to direct. And it looks like I'm running out of time. I do want to thank most of all Edward J. Larson, for whom I give full credit. In his book, Summer for the Gods, an amazingly researched account of the Scopes trial and the history and issues that surround it, he has enlightened me beyond measure, far beyond my initial screening of Inherit the Wind. I recommend it to all viewers for further information on this trial. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Janie Hegarty. This is Freethought Forum.
I think as I please, and this gives me pleasure.
My conscience decrees, this right I must treasure.
My thoughts will not cater
To duke or dictator, no person can deny. Die Gedanken sind frei, no person can deny. Die Gedanken